Hey y'all, Melissa of Melly Sews with you today, and today we're going to be talking about how to mark your fabric. I have an array of traditional and more non-traditional marking tools out here in front of me, so we're going to go over how to use each one of these things. Okay, the first type of tool to use for marking is a pretty traditional one. This is tracing paper and a tracing wheel. You can see that this tracing paper has the marking medium on one side and not on the other. And they generally come pre-folded so that you can put it in between two layers of fabric, mark both layers at the same time. To use this, what you would do is put the side with the marking medium against the side of the fabric that you want marked. Now this may be the right side of your fabric and it might be the wrong side. It depends on what you're marking. Pretend that we are marking a dart. I would put this on the wrong side of my fabric, and then the pattern would be pinned on top so that I would have my guidelines on the pattern for what I'm marking. And then you just take the tracing wheel. There's generally a place to rest your finger, and you put a good amount of pressure, and you're going to work back and forth over whatever line that you are marking. And then what you'll see is that this transfers the mark onto the fabric. Now, this does not always wash out of all types of fabrics. So this is a different type of marking paper. This is more like a fabric, and it's embedded with water-soluble ink. So this is something that will for sure wash out, unlike the traditional tracing paper, which may or may not wash out. It depends on the fabric that you are using. You use this the same way though. You're going to put it between your layers of fabric or use it as a single layer. You're going to use your tracing wheel and mark over it. And you'll see that it leaves a pretty faint line, but you can still see where you marked, and this, once it gets wet, is going to disappear. So that's another option instead of traditional tracing paper. It also, because it has that water-soluble ink in it, you have to keep it feels kind of damp, and you want to keep it that way. You don't let it dry out. So it's stored in plastic generally. Another marking option, I really like these washable children's markers. I noticed when my kids started using these and it would get on their clothing that it generally washed out of just about everything. So these actually make excellent markers for sewing as well. You can choose a complementary color to whatever fabric that you are marking on, and you just draw your marks, and then those wash out in the wash. Now, I wouldn't necessarily use a purple if I was actually sewing white fabric because it might leave a little bit of a stain behind, but I also actually wouldn't use the dark blue tracing paper either necessarily. You want to take in consideration if it doesn't wash out and it's in a seam line or something, how bad is it going to look? So like you can see barely that this blue marking left marks that bled through to the right side of the fabric. So keep that in mind when you're choosing your marking tool. Another marking tool is these disappearing or water-soluble inks. So we have the air and water-soluble ink, and what happens with this one, this is just a marker, and you mark right on, and eventually this dries out, and as it dries out, it disappears. So if you're the type of person who sews a little bit every day over a long period of time to complete a project, this is not a good option because it might have disappeared by the time you get to the step where you need the mark. The other side is water-soluble ink. This is very similar to that tracing paper I showed you, and it's going to make a mark that when you spray it with water, it's going to disappear, so it washes out. But I find these don't necessarily last as long as my trusty washable markers. So again, always test your marking technique on any fabric that's precious that you're worried about it washing out of. Another marking tool, this is called a friction pen, and this is not actually made for fabric marking, but a lot of people use it. So what happens with a friction pen is when you write, you'll see that it just makes a mark. However, when you apply heat to this mark, the mark will disappear. The problem with these is that if the fabric gets really cold again, the mark will reappear. So just use caution. This is probably great for something you want to mark in the seam allowances, but it's not necessarily a good thing if you don't want phantom marks possibly reappearing on your garment. So I rarely use this for marking myself. The only time I do find it useful is if I am transferring an embroidery pattern that I'm sure is going to be solidly covered with embroidery thread. Then I don't mind worrying about like, oh, this is going to reappear. This is a more traditional one. This is chalk. And this often comes, you can buy just the sticks like to write on a chalkboard, or you can buy these type of kind of like chalk holders. And generally what they have is they'll have something where you can insert chalk, and it makes it easier for you to hold and less messy than traditional chalk. So you just mark with the chalk to use these. They also generally come with several colors of chalk so that you can choose the one that works best with your fabric and your project. The markers work well on this as well, but let me show you a little more traditional method of marking, but you might not have heard of it because people don't use it so often. This is soap. If you use plain white soap when it gets like down to those slivers that you can barely wash with, keep those because it's very faint, but you can use that to make marks on your fabric, and of course, since it is soap, it washes right out of your fabric. This actually is part of a beauty bar that has a lot more oil in it, so I wouldn't actually use this one to mark a fabric project. It's better to use just like plain old ivory soap that is just soap without like a lot of extra oil or moisturizers in it. Finally, if your fabric is not going to be washed at all, let's say you're doing a silk project and you're only going to dry clean this, you can actually use thread to mark your fabric. So what you would do for that is you just take your thread and you pull it in wherever you need to mark, and you leave yourself a long tail past the knot. It's a little extra room, and say you needed to mark a straight line, you could just back stitch yourself a little straight line. Sometimes you just need to mark a point, like gather between these 2 points. You would just pull the thread up in 1 point then. So there's a back stitch, so I could mark a line if I want. And then when you're done marking whatever you need to mark, leave yourself a long tail before you snip your thread. And that way, when I'm done with whatever stitching I need to do, you can just pull that thread right back out. Use large stitches, as large as possible, to do this if you're going to stitch a line on. So you can just pull it right out. And those are some different ways to mark your fabric. I hope you found something useful here, and I'm going to have links below to a lot of these products in case you saw something you like and you want to try it.